The candles on the table flickered, and across from me, my 4-year-old daughter was carefully counting the breadsticks in the basket like it was the most important job in the world. It was supposed to be a quiet anniversary dinner. 3 years since the accident. 3 years since I buried an empty casket because they never found his body. And then I looked up and I saw my dead husband laughing with another woman, holding a little boy's hand, sitting 4 tables away like he belonged there. Like he had always belonged there. If you're invested in this story already, please hit subscribe and leave a comment, because what I'm about to tell you gets worse before it gets better. Much worse. There were nights during all of this when I genuinely did not know if I would make it through to the other side. I did. But it cost me more than I ever imagined a single lie could cost a person. My name is Rachel Whitfield. I'm 34 years old. I live outside Denver, Colorado, in a house I bought entirely on my own 18 months ago, after selling the one my husband and I had picked out together when we were young and stupid and believed forever was a guarantee instead of a hope you have to keep choosing every single day. My husband's name was Marcus. Was. That's the word I had trained myself to use for 3 years. Past tense. Dead. Gone. A man who existed only in photographs and in the shape of our daughter's eyes. Marcus worked in logistics, traveling constantly for a freight company headquartered in Chicago. 3 weeks out of every month, he was somewhere else. Salt Lake City. Phoenix. Once, memorably, 2 months in Singapore setting up a new shipping contract. I never questioned it. I trusted him completely. I was a kindergarten teacher with a daughter named Sophie, who looked exactly like her father, same stubborn chin, same way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday in October, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice, formal, careful, told me there had been a small plane crash over a remote stretch of mountains in Colorado. Marcus had been on a charter flight with 3 colleagues, flying to a meeting in a town too small for commercial airports. The plane went down in a canyon. Search and rescue spent 2 weeks combing the wreckage site. They recovered the bodies of the pilot and 2 passengers. They never recovered Marcus. The investigators told me that in terrain like that, with the conditions with the wildlife, it was entirely possible a body would never be found. They told me, gently, that I needed to consider him deceased. The company's insurance needed a death certificate to process the life insurance payout. The state required a waiting period before they would issue one without a body, but because of corroborating witness testimony, eyewitnesses who saw the plane go down with all 4 men visibly aboard, the process moved faster than usual. I held a funeral with an empty casket. Sophie was 1 year old. She doesn't remember any of it. I remember every second. For the next 3 years, I rebuilt my life around a hole shaped exactly like Marcus. I kept his side of the closet for almost a year before I could bring myself to donate his clothes. I kept his voicemail greeting on my phone long after I stopped using that carrier, just so I could call it sometimes and hear him say, "You've reached Marcus. Leave a message." I went to grief counseling. I joined a support group for young widows. I taught myself, slowly, painfully, how to be a single mother, how to fix a garbage disposal, how to fall asleep in an empty bed without reaching for someone who wasn't there. The life insurance payout was substantial, $400,000, enough to pay off the house and put money away for Sophie's future. I never touched most of it. It felt like blood money. It felt like the universe's apology for something that could never actually be made right. 3 years. 3 years of birthdays without him, of Christmas mornings explaining to a toddler why Daddy was a photograph on the mantle instead of a person at the table, of nights crying quietly in the bathroom so Sophie wouldn't hear. 3 years of slowly, carefully, painfully learning to breathe again. There were small things that should have bothered me more than they did. The fact that Marcus's mother, Linda, stopped returning my calls about 8 months after the funeral, drifting away with a vagueness I'd attributed to grief, the kind of quiet withdrawal some people do when a loss is too painful to keep revisiting. The fact that, going through his old emails once, almost a year in, I found a deleted folder I couldn't access, locked behind a password I didn't have. I told myself it was nothing. Work documents. Confidential client information. I told myself a lot of things during that first year because the alternative, that something underneath my grief didn't add up, was too enormous to hold while I was also trying to keep a toddler fed and clothed and loved. And then, on our anniversary, the day Marcus and I had gotten married 9 years earlier, I took Sophie to dinner at a steakhouse downtown. A silly little tradition I'd started after his death, taking her somewhere nice on the day that used to mean something, trying to build new meaning out of old wounds. I looked up from the breadstick basket, and the air left my lungs. He was sitting 4 tables away. Same jawline. Same way of running his hand through his hair when he laughed. A few pounds heavier. A haircut I didn't recognize, but unmistakably, impossibly Marcus. My dead husband. Laughing at something a woman across from him said. A woman with dark hair and an expensive watch, leaning into him like they had done this 1,000 times before. And beside her a little boy, maybe 5 years old, drawing on the back of a paper placemat with a crayon, occasionally tugging on Marcus's sleeve to show him something. My hands started shaking so violently I knocked over my water glass. The sound of it shattering against the floor made half the restaurant turn to look, including him. For one full second, our eyes met across the restaurant. I watched the blood drain from his face. I watched recognition hit him like a physical blow. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, he grabbed his napkin, said something quickly to the woman, and walked toward the back of the restaurant like a man heading to the restroom. Like a man who had all the time in the world. He didn't come back. I sat there frozen, Sophie tugging at my sleeve asking why Mommy was crying, while the waiter rushed over with a towel for the spilled water, while the woman at his table looked around in confusion, while the little boy kept coloring, completely unaware that his world was about to be detonated by a stranger he had never met. By the time I gathered myself enough to walk over to that table, Marcus was gone. Out a back exit, I assumed. The woman looked at me with polite confusion as I stood over her, my daughter's hand gripped tight in mine. "Can I help you?" she asked. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. What was I supposed to say? "Excuse me, the man you were just having dinner with is my husband. Except he's supposed to be dead. Except apparently he isn't. Except I don't actually know what's happening right now because my entire reality just cracked open like an egg. Where did he go?" I finally managed. "The man you were sitting with." She frowned, glancing toward the back hallway. "Tom? He said he had a work call. Is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "You have no idea," I thought. "What's his last name?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The woman's confusion deepened into something sharper, more guarded, the protective instinct of a person sensing a threat to her family without yet understanding its shape. "Why do you want to know that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I turned, scooped Sophie up even though she was getting too big to be carried, and walked out of that restaurant so fast the hostess called after me asking if everything was all right. Nothing was all right. Nothing would be all right for a very long time. If you've ever had the ground disappear beneath your feet in real time, you know there isn't a word for what that feels like. I drove home on autopilot, Sophie singing along to a kid's song on the radio, completely unaware that her mother's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, that her mother had just seen a ghost eat dinner with another family. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at nothing, replaying his face over and over. The way he'd looked at me, not confused, not like a man who'd seen a stranger who resembled his dead wife. He looked terrified. He looked caught. A man who'd seen a ghost doesn't run. A man hiding a secret does. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to fall apart. I had spent 3 years falling apart. I had cried every tear I had for a man who, it turned out, hadn't even had the decency to actually die. This time, I was going to find out the truth, and I was going to do it methodically, carefully, the way you defuse a bomb instead of running from one. The first thing I did was call my sister, Megan, who worked as a paralegal at a firm downtown and had spent half her career around investigators and lawyers. "Slow down," she said after I'd spent 5 minutes talking too fast for her to follow. "Are you telling me you saw Marcus? Alive? Last night?" "I'm telling you I saw a man who looked exactly like Marcus, had Marcus's mannerisms and ran the second he saw me, with a different name, sitting at a table with a woman and a little boy who looked like he could be Sophie's brother." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Rachel," she finally said, her voice careful, I need you to understand what you're suggesting. You're suggesting that Marcus faked his death.
That's not a small thing.
That's insurance fraud. That's identity fraud. That's potentially a dozen federal crimes. If this is real, we need to be smart about how we handle it. I know, I said. That's why I'm calling you and not driving back to that restaurant with a baseball bat. She laughed despite herself, a tight, nervous sound. Okay. First thing, don't confront him alone again. If he ran once, he'll run again, and next time he might disappear for good. We need proof before we do anything. Photos, documentation, something concrete. How do I get proof of a man who doesn't want to be found? You hire someone who's good at finding people who don't want to be found. That afternoon, Megan put me in touch with a private investigator named Diane Foss, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had spent 15 years working insurance fraud cases before going independent. I told her everything. The crash, the funeral, the insurance payout, the restaurant, the fake name. Diane listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, her face giving nothing away. Insurance fraud through a faked death is rarer than people think, she said when I finished. But it's not impossible, especially in situations with poor wreckage recovery. If your husband colluded with someone on that flight, or even just walked away from the crash site and disappeared into the wilderness before search and rescue arrived, it's theoretically possible. I'll need everything you have. Insurance documents, his old phone records if you still have access, any financial accounts, photographs, anything. How long will this take? If he's still in the area and not actively hiding under a new identity with serious resources, days. If he's gone further underground, longer.
But you said he panicked and ran.
That tells me he's not as prepared as he thinks he is. Panicked men make mistakes. I went home that night and pulled every box of Marcus's old belongings out of the garage, things I'd kept but never been able to look at. Old phone bills. Bank statements from the joint account we'd shared before his death. Photographs. I found myself staring at our wedding photo for a long time, the two of us laughing under a string of fairy lights, both of us so young, so certain of a future that had apparently been a lie even back then, or maybe not even back then. Maybe something that curdled later. I didn't know, and not knowing was its own particular kind of torture. Diane called me 4 days later. I found him, she said. His name now is Thomas Reyes. He's been living under that identity for approximately 2.5 years, which lines up almost exactly with the timeline after his disappearance. He works as a regional sales director for a building materials company. He's married Rachel, legally married, to a woman named Claire Reyes. They have a 5-year-old son named Henry. The room tilted around me. He's married? He's actually married to her. Marriage license filed in Wyoming 18 months ago, which means either the marriage isn't legally valid because he's still legally married to you, or he found a way to falsify documentation that made him appear unmarried. Given everything else, I'd bet on the latter. This man built an entire second identity with real documentation. That takes resources and planning. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a man who survived a crash and panicked and ran into the wilderness. This was premeditated. I sat with that for a long moment. Premeditated. My husband hadn't survived a horrifying accident and made a desperate, irrational choice in the chaos of trauma. He had planned this. He had built an exit ramp out of our marriage, out of fatherhood to Sophie, out of his entire existence, and used a plane crash that killed 2 other men as his cover story. There's something else, Diane said, her voice dropping slightly. I pulled some financial records. Before the crash, there was a series of unusual transactions in an account you weren't listed on. An account he opened 6 months before the flight. Nearly $60,000 moved through it in small increments, structured specifically to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. That's not a coincidence. That's planning. Where did the money go? Some of it appears to have funded a new identity. Documents aren't cheap when you're doing it thoroughly. Some of it went into an account that, interestingly, is jointly held with Claire Reyes now. He didn't just run from you, Rachel. He ran towards something. Or someone. I thought about the woman at the restaurant table, leaning into him, comfortable, familiar. I thought about how long 2.5 years was. The marriage to Claire happened 18 months ago, which meant he'd been with her, in some capacity, even before that. Was he seeing her before the crash? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Diane hesitated. I can't confirm that without more digging, but given the timeline of the account opening and the speed at which the second identity was established afterward, I think it's a strong possibility. I'm sorry, Rachel. I know this isn't easy to hear. I hung up the phone and sat in my dark kitchen for a long time, Sophie's night light glowing faintly down the hallway, and I let myself feel every single thing I had been too numb to feel since the restaurant. The grief I'd processed for 3 years wasn't even the real grief. The real grief was this. Not that my husband had died, but that my husband had chosen, deliberately, methodically, to erase me and our daughter from his life, as if we were an inconvenient debt to be paid off and walked away from. I didn't cry. I had expected to cry. Instead, something in me went very, very still and very, very cold. The next morning, I called Diane back. I want everything, I said. Every document. Every transaction. I want a paper trail so complete that there isn't a single court in this country that could look at it and call it anything other than what it is. That's exactly the right instinct, Diane said. And there's one more thing you should know. The life insurance payout, the $400,000. If this comes out, the insurance company is going to want every cent of that back, plus they're likely going to pursue fraud charges against him directly. You're not just looking at exposing a secret. You're looking at potentially sending the father of your daughter to federal prison. I thought about Sophie, asleep down the hall, who had grown up believing her father was a hero who died doing his job, a story I had told her with love because it was the only kindness I had left to give her about a man who, it turned out, didn't deserve a single ounce of it. He made his choice 3 years ago, I said. I'm not going to protect him from the consequences of it. It took another 2 weeks for Diane to build the case file. In that time, I went through what I can only describe as 5 different emotional stages simultaneously, sometimes in the same hour. Grief from marriage that I now understood had been ending long before that plane went down. Rage at the audacity of a man who let me grieve him publicly, who let our daughter grow up fatherless, who collected sympathy from our friends and family while building a new life 40 minutes away from the one he'd destroyed. Guilt, irrationally, for not somehow knowing, for not seeing whatever signs must have been there. And underneath all of it, a hard, clarifying resolve that I had never felt before in my life. During those 2 weeks, I also did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called Marcus's mother, Linda.
I want to be honest about why.
Part of it was instinct, the way you reach for the people who used to be family even after everything else has fallen apart. But part of it was suspicion. The way she'd drifted away from me after the funeral had always nagged at the back of my mind, and now, with everything I knew, it nagged harder. She didn't answer the first 2 times. On the 3rd call, she picked up, and her voice was tight, guarded, the voice of someone who had been expecting this call and dreading it. "Rachel," she said. "How are you?" "I think you know exactly how I am, Linda," I said. "I saw him 3 weeks ago.
Alive.
Sitting in a restaurant with a wife and a son. I need to know if you knew." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything before she said a single word. "I found out about 8 months after the crash," she finally admitted, her voice cracking. "He called me, begged me not to say anything, told me he'd send me money if I just stayed quiet, that it would destroy everything if I told you, that you'd never understand. I told myself I was protecting you from more pain. I told myself that for 2.5 years. I am so sorry, Rachel. I am so sorry." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, feeling something inside me crack open even further, a betrayal I hadn't anticipated layered on top of the one I was already drowning in. Marcus's own mother had known, had watched me grieve at the funeral, had watched me raise Sophie alone, had taken my calls less and less because she couldn't stand to keep lying to my face, and had said nothing. "Did he send you money?" I asked, my voice flat. "A few $1,000s over time." I never asked where it came from. I think some part of me didn't want to know. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I told Diane about the conversation the next day, and she added it to the file without comment, though I could tell by the set of her jaw that she found it as disturbing as I did. It wasn't evidence of a crime on Linda's part, not exactly, but it was one more piece of the architecture of deception that Marcus had built around himself, one more person who had chosen his comfort over my truth. I also had to make a decision about how to approach the confrontation with Marcus directly. Diane was firm on this point. Don't go to him directly again. Last time he ran. This time, we need to control the situation. I recommend going through an attorney first, establishing your legal position, and then deciding how to proceed with both the criminal exposure and what you want personally, in terms of him, in terms of Sophie. I hired a lawyer named Patricia Alvarez, who specialized in complex family law cases and, as it turned out, had handled exactly one other case involving a faked death in her 15-year career. Legally speaking, Patricia explained during our first meeting, your marriage to Marcus was never dissolved. A death certificate isn't a divorce. If he is, in fact, alive, your marriage is still active, which means his marriage to this Claire Reyes is bigamous and void, regardless of what name he used to enter into it. That actually simplifies some things for you. You have full legal standing as his wife. You're entitled to pursue him for fraud related to the insurance payout, which, frankly, given the circumstances, you may want to return voluntarily before they come after you for it, since you received those funds based on fraudulent information, even though you had no knowledge of the fraud. I'll pay it back, I said immediately. Every cent. I never touched most of it anyway.
Good.
That protects you. As for Sophie, his abandonment, regardless of the unusual circumstances, actually strengthens your position enormously in any custody proceeding, should he attempt to reassert parental rights, which I doubt he will, given the legal exposure he's facing. But you should be prepared. Men who have shown a willingness to fake their own death to escape responsibility are not always predictable in how they respond to being caught. That warning sat with me for days. I started locking the doors at night that I used to leave unlocked. I started watching the street outside my house a little more carefully. I wasn't sure what I expected Marcus to do once he realized I knew, but I had learned, in the span of about 2 weeks, that I had no idea who this man actually was, which meant I had no idea what he was capable of. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't something I planned. It happened because Marcus found me first. It was a Thursday evening, almost 3 weeks after the restaurant. I was in the driveway unloading groceries, Sophie inside watching cartoons with a babysitter, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up across the street and a man got out. For a half second, with the streetlights behind him, I almost didn't recognize him either. The haircut still threw me, the slightly different way he carried himself. But then he walked closer, and it was unmistakably him. Unmistakably Marcus. My husband. My dead husband. Standing on my street like he had every right to be there. Rachel, he said, his voice cracking slightly.
Please.
Just give me 5 minutes. Every instinct in my body told me to run inside and lock the door. But a colder, more deliberate part of me, the part that had spent 3 weeks building a case file thick enough to bury him, told me to stand my ground. You have 5 minutes, I said. And then I'm calling the police. He flinched at that, glancing nervously up and down the street like he expected sirens to materialize out of nowhere. I know you have every right to hate me. I know there's nothing I can say that's going to fix this. But I need you to understand. I didn't plan to hurt you. The crash, the chaos of it, I had this moment where I realized I could disappear, and everything that was crushing me would just disappear with me. What was crushing you, Marcus? My voice came out flat, controlled, nothing like the trembling wreck I'd been 3 weeks earlier in that restaurant. Was it your wife? Your daughter? The mortgage on the house we bought together? Tell me, what exactly about our life was so unbearable that faking your own death and letting me bury an empty casket seemed like the reasonable solution? He had no answer for that.
Of course he didn't.
I was drowning, he finally said. The job, the debt, I'd made some bad investments before the crash, things you didn't know about, and I was terrified of what it would do to us, to you if it all came out. And then the plane went down and everyone else died and I survived, and I walked. I walked for 2 days through the mountains until I found a road, and somewhere in that walk, I made the worst decision of my life. You made several worse decisions of your life. I said. Walking away was the first one. Building an entire fake identity was the second. Marrying another woman while you were still legally married to me was the third. Having a son with her was the fourth. Calling your own mother and swearing her to silence so she'd let me keep grieving you was the fifth. And letting your actual daughter grow up believing her father died a hero instead of abandoned her like garbage, that's the one I will never, ever forgive. His face went pale. You talked to my mother? I talked to your mother. I confirmed. She told me everything. The phone call, the money, 2.5 years of watching me grieve and saying nothing. You didn't just destroy our family, Marcus. You recruited an accomplice to help you keep destroying it. He flinched again, harder this time, like the words had physically struck him. Does Claire know? I asked. Does she know any of this? Does she know you're not actually Thomas Reyes? Does she know you have a wife and a daughter 40 minutes away who buried you 3 years ago? His silence was its own answer. She doesn't know anything, I said slowly, the full weight of it settling on me. You did it again. You built an entire life with her, a marriage, a child, and she has no idea any of it is a lie. You're not capable of being honest with anyone, are you? Not me, not her, not yourself. Rachel, please, I'm begging you, don't destroy what I've built. Henry is innocent in all of this. Claire is innocent. If you go to the police, if this comes out, it ruins everything for them too. And there it was. The thing that finally, completely, extinguished any last flicker of mercy I might have had buried somewhere underneath 3 weeks of fury. He wasn't asking me to spare him. He was asking me to spare his new family at the expense of his real one. He was standing in front of the woman he had let grieve him for 3 years, the mother of his actual child, and asking her to absorb the consequences of his crimes so that his second, illegitimate life could continue undisturbed. You faked your death to escape me, I said, my voice perfectly steady now, and now you're standing in my driveway asking me to protect the family you built on top of that lie. Do you hear yourself, Marcus? Do you understand what you're actually asking? I'm asking you to have mercy. You didn't have mercy on me, I said. You let me sit in a funeral home picking out an empty casket. You let our 1-year-old daughter grow up without a father because you decided your debts and your guilt were more important than your family. You don't get to ask me for mercy. You used up every ounce of mercy I had 3 weeks ago when you ran out the back door of a restaurant instead of facing what you'd done. I turned, walked into my house, and locked the door behind me. Through the front window, I watched him stand on the sidewalk for a long moment, and then, finally, he got back into his car and drove away. I called Patricia and Diane that same night. By morning, the wheels were already in motion. Patricia filed the necessary documentation establishing my standing as Marcus's legal wife and notifying the relevant courts of his fraudulent death and subsequent bigamous marriage. Diane forwarded the full investigative file to the insurance company that had paid out the policy, along with a formal letter from Patricia outlining my intent to voluntarily repay the funds upon resolution of the matter, demonstrating my good faith and lack of involvement. Within a week, the insurance company had opened its own fraud investigation. Within 2 weeks, federal investigators were involved because faked deaths involving insurance payouts and falsified identity documents cross into territory the FBI takes seriously. I learned later that insurance fraud of this kind, particularly when it involves staging a death using a real accident as cover, can carry federal charges that result in years of prison time, on top of state-level charges for identity fraud and bigamy. The part one wasn't prepared for was Claire. About 3 weeks after the driveway confrontation, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, shaking, barely composed. Is this Rachel? She asked. This is Claire. Claire Reyes. I think you know my husband. Or, I guess, I don't even know what to call him anymore. My stomach dropped. Claire, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to find out this way. Find out what way? Her voice cracked. He told me everything 2 days ago. After men in suits showed up at his office asking him questions, he came home and told me his real name isn't Thomas, it's Marcus, that he's not actually divorced like he told me, that he has a wife and a daughter he let everyone believe were grieving a dead man. I've spent the last 2 days trying to figure out if my marriage, my son's entire existence, is even real. I sat down at my kitchen table, the full horror of what Marcus had done finally landing on me from an angle I hadn't fully considered. I had been so consumed by my own betrayal that I hadn't fully processed that there was another woman out there who had been just as deceived as I was, who had built her entire life on a foundation of lies just as thoroughly as I had, the only difference being that her foundation had been laid on top of the wreckage of mine. "Claire," I said carefully, "I want you to know, none of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You married a man who lied to you about literally everything that matters. You're not my enemy in this. He is." There was a long silence, and then quiet crying on the other end of the line. Henry asked me yesterday why Daddy was crying in his office with the door locked.
I didn't know what to tell him.
I still don't know what to tell him. How do I explain to a 5-year-old that his father isn't who he said he was? I don't have an answer for that, I said honestly. I'm dealing with the same question with my daughter, except mine is going to have to learn that the heroic story I told her about her father's death was a lie and that he chose to abandon her. I don't know which version is worse for a child to hear. We talked for almost an hour that night, two women who had never met, who had every reason to despise each other, finding an unexpected, painful kind of solidarity in the wreckage Marcus had left behind. Claire told me she'd met Marcus, or Thomas as she knew him, at a community fundraiser about 2 years and 4 months ago, which meant, doing the math, he had begun building his relationship with her only a handful of months after disappearing from my life. He had told her he was a widower whose wife died of cancer, a detail so specifically cruel, borrowing the language of real grief to manufacture sympathy and intimacy with a new woman that I felt sick hearing it. "He's very good at this," Claire said bitterly. "At making you feel like you're the only person who's ever really understood him." I thought that was love. I think now it might just be a skill he has. A skill he's used on at least 2 of us. Before we hung up that night, Claire told me something else. Something that turned the cold, settled fury I'd been carrying into something sharper.
"There's a storage unit," she said.
I found the key in his desk a few weeks before all this happened, before I even knew anything was wrong. I never opened it. I assumed it was work files. After he confessed everything, I went and looked. What was in it? Boxes of documents. Old identification, blank templates, some kind of laminating equipment. And a folder with your name on it, Rachel. Newspaper clippings about the crash. Photos of you and Sophie. Printed off what looked like your old social media. I think he was watching you. This whole time. The thought of Marcus quietly tracking my life from a storage unit 40 minutes away, collecting photos of our daughter growing up while I believed him dead, made something in me go cold in a new and different way than anything before it. It wasn't just that he'd left. It was that he'd left and then kept a private archive of the life he'd abandoned, like a man checking in on an investment he wasn't ready to fully write off. I gave Diane and Patricia the information about the storage unit immediately. Within days, it became part of the federal investigation, additional physical evidence that obliterated any remaining argument that Marcus's disappearance had been an impulsive, trauma-driven accident rather than a sustained, deliberate operation. In the weeks that followed, the legal situation grew more complicated and more public than I had ever anticipated. Local news picked up the story once the federal investigation became a matter of public record. Man faked death in plane crash, built second family under false identity, ran as a headline in at least 3 outlets, and suddenly, I wasn't just a grieving widow rebuilding her life. I was a character in a tabloid-worthy scandal, fielding calls from reporters, watching strangers online speculate about my marriage, about whether I'd known, about whether I was somehow complicit, a particularly cruel rumor that spread faster than the truth ever could. I lost my temporary peace almost entirely during this period. Reporters called my school. One showed up outside Sophie's preschool until the administration, thankfully, intervened and had him removed from the property. I had to explain to a room of 5-year-olds' parents, in a hastily called meeting, why there were cameras parked outside the building, a humiliation I hadn't anticipated needing to survive on top of everything else. Marcus was arrested on a Tuesday morning, Federal agents showing up at the building materials company where he worked as Thomas Reyes, walking him out in handcuffs in front of his co-workers. I didn't witness it, but Diane sent me a screenshot of the local news coverage, and I stared at the photo of him being led to an unmarked car for a long time, trying to feel something other than the cold, hollow satisfaction that had settled into my chest weeks earlier. He was charged with insurance fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and bigamy. His attorney attempted to argue diminished capacity, claiming the trauma of surviving the plane crash had caused a temporary psychological break that led to his decision to disappear, but the financial records told a different story. The $60,000 moved through hidden accounts in the 6 months before the crash. The fake identification, purchased and prepared in advance. The fact that he had, according to Diane's investigation, researched the specific stretch of wilderness around the crash site months before the flight ever happened, looking for terrain remote enough that a body might never be recovered. The storage unit, with its archive of my daughter's childhood collected from a distance, like a man cataloging something he'd stolen. It hadn't been a panic decision made in the chaos of trauma. It had been a plan, executed with chilling precision, using 2 dead men and a grieving wife as cover. A few days before the trial, Marcus's defense attorney reached out to Patricia with an offer. If I would agree to provide a statement minimizing the psychological harm of his disappearance, framing it as understandable given his claimed financial distress, the defense believed it could secure a significantly reduced sentence, perhaps as little as 18 months. Patricia relayed the offer to me without any pressure either way, simply laying out what it would mean. I didn't need to think about it for very long. Tell them no, I said. Tell them I have 3 years of an empty casket and a daughter who used to ask why she didn't have a daddy like the other kids at school. Tell them I'm not interested in making this easier for him. The court date for the criminal proceedings was set for several months out, but the civil matters moved faster. My marriage to Marcus was formally annulled on the grounds that his death certificate, however unintentionally fraudulent on my part, had been based on his own deliberate deception, and the court recognized that I had entered no new legal commitments based on a false belief in his survival. The $400,000 in insurance money I repaid in full, using the money that had sat untouched in a separate account for 3 years. Money I had never been able to bring myself to spend because some part of me, it turned out, had always known something was wrong, even if I couldn't have named it. I want to tell you that the moment I handed over that money, I felt free.
I didn't, not yet.
But it was the first stone removed from a weight I'd been carrying without knowing its full size. Claire's situation was, in some ways, even more legally complicated than mine. Because her marriage to Thomas Reyes had been entered into based on entirely fraudulent identity documents, the court eventually ruled the marriage void from its inception, not merely annulled but essentially as though it had never legally existed at all. She kept her home, since it had been purchased in her name using her own income. She retained full custody of Henry, given that Marcus's legal status was, at best, a man facing serious federal prison time, and at worst, a man who had already proven himself capable of erasing his own family without warning. In an unexpected turn that I think surprised both of us, Claire reached out to me again about 2 months after the arrest, asking if I would be willing to meet in person. We met at a coffee shop, both of us visibly nervous, 2 women bound together by a man who had betrayed us in nearly identical ways. I keep thinking about your daughter, Claire said, stirring her coffee without drinking it.
Sophie.
Henry has a sister he's never met. Half-sister, I guess, technically, but still. I hadn't let myself think that far ahead, but she was right. Sophie had a brother, born to the same man, just months apart in the grand scheme of things. 2 children who had been built into the architecture of Marcus's deception without ever having a say in any of it. I don't know what the right thing to do is, I admitted. Part of me wants to keep them as far away from any of this as possible. But another part of me thinks they didn't choose this any more than we did, and maybe they shouldn't have to grow up not knowing they have a sibling out there. We agreed, cautiously, to think about it, to take things slowly, to prioritize our children's well-being over our own complicated feelings about a man who had managed to wound us both so deeply that, in some strange way, we'd ended up finding more honesty and understanding with each other than either of us had ever had with him. Around the same time, something happened that I still think about more than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. Diane called me on a Friday evening, her voice carrying a note of caution I hadn't heard from her before. "There's something in the financial records I need to walk you through carefully," she said. "It's about the plane." My stomach dropped. What about the plane? The charter company that operated the flight has been cooperating with the federal investigation, since obviously they have their own liability exposure here. One of their maintenance logs shows a service request Marcus made personally about 3 weeks before the flight, asking specifically about that particular aircraft's emergency locator transponder, the device that's supposed to broadcast a crash site location to search and rescue. He asked detailed questions about how it worked and under what conditions it might fail to transmit. I sat very still, the phone pressed hard against my ear. "Are you saying he had something to do with why they couldn't find him?" "I'm saying I can't prove sabotage, and frankly, given that 2 other men died in that crash, I don't believe for a second he was trying to cause an accident. I think the far more likely explanation, and this is corroborated by interviews with the surviving ground crew, is that he was trying to understand how to make himself harder to locate after the crash happened, assuming, correctly as it turned out, that a crash in that terrain was already a real risk given the weather patterns that time of year and the age of the aircraft. He wasn't planning the crash. He was planning what to do if one occurred. He was essentially prepositioning himself to take advantage of a tragedy he suspected might happen anyway, given how many close calls that particular charter company had on record. I felt sick in an entirely new way. Not because he had caused the deaths of the pilot and his 2 colleagues. The investigation never found any evidence of that, and I want to be clear that nothing ever suggested Marcus had a hand in causing the crash itself. But the idea that he had been quietly studying the mechanics of his own potential disappearance for weeks before it happened, treating the real, mortal danger of an unsafe charter flight as an opportunity rather than a risk to be avoided or reported, told me something about the calculus running behind his eyes that I don't think I will ever fully be able to make peace with. 2 men died on that mountain. My husband, in some cold, calculating corner of his mind, had been quietly hoping the conditions might break in his favor. That detail came out at trial, and it was, I think, the moment the jury's expression shifted from something like uncomfortable sympathy for a man who'd made a desperate mistake to something closer to the horror I'd been carrying for months. It is one thing to run from your life in a moment of panic. It is another thing entirely to have spent weeks anticipating the opportunity and quietly preparing to take it, while 2 other families had no idea their husbands and fathers were flying with a man already halfway out the door of his own existence. I called the widow of one of the other passengers after I learned this, a woman named Patty, whose husband Greg had been the company's chief engineer, a man I'd met exactly twice at office holiday parties and barely remembered beyond his booming laugh. I didn't know if I had any right to call her, didn't know what I would even say, but I felt like she deserved to hear it from me rather than from a news report. She was quiet for a long time on the phone. "I always wondered why they never found Marcus," she finally said. "I used to lay awake some nights wondering if maybe he was still out there somewhere, lost, suffering, and we just never looked hard enough. Do you know how many hours search and rescue spent on that mountain looking for a man who was already walking toward a bus station?" Her voice wasn't cruel, just exhausted, carrying 3 years of a grief that had been, in its own way, just as deceived as mine, just without the eventual reveal. I had nothing to offer her except the truth and an apology that could never be big enough to cover what her family had lost. We still talk sometimes, 2 women bound together by a tragedy that turned out to be only half real for one of the men involved. There was one more confrontation before the trial, one I hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared for. Marcus's mother, Linda, showed up at my house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, asking to see Sophie. I stood in my doorway and refused, plainly and without apology. "She's my granddaughter," Linda said, tears in her eyes. "I haven't done anything to her." "You knew he was alive for 2.5 years, I said. "You let me grieve a man you knew wasn't dead. You let your granddaughter grow up believing her father was a hero instead of telling the truth that might have given her a chance to actually know him, or at least know what he really was. You don't get access to her just because the consequences finally caught up with your son." "I made a mistake," Linda said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to protect my child." "I know," I said, and for the first time in the conversation, my voice softened slightly, not out of forgiveness, but out of a strange, weary understanding. That's exactly the problem, Linda. Everyone around this man has spent years protecting him instead of the people he was hurting. I'm done being one of the people who pays the price for that. She left without another word, and I didn't hear from her again until the trial. The criminal trial happened 9 months after that night in the restaurant. I testified. I sat in a courtroom and described, in painstaking detail, what it felt like to bury an empty casket, to raise a daughter who believed her father was dead, to spend 3 years grieving a man who had simply walked away from a plane crash and decided his old life was disposable. Claire testified too, describing what it felt like to build a marriage and a family on a foundation of lies she never knew she was standing on. Diane testified about the financial trail, the storage unit, the months of premeditation that contradicted any claim of a panicked, trauma-driven decision. Marcus sat at the defense table throughout both of our testimonies, and I watched him, searching for some sign of the man I had married 9 years earlier, some flicker of the person who had once stood under string lights and promised me forever. I didn't find him. Maybe he had never existed the way I remembered him. Maybe I had simply been very good at not seeing what was always there, a man capable of walking away from everything and everyone the moment things became inconvenient enough. During closing arguments, the prosecutor laid out the timeline with a clarity that, even having lived through every piece of it, still managed to take my breath away. The hidden account opened 6 months before the flight. The research into the crash site terrain, conducted in the weeks before the trip, was even scheduled. The blank identification templates purchased online 4 months prior. The new relationship with Claire, begun less than half a year after his disappearance, built on a fabricated story of widowhood borrowed cruelly from the very grief he had inflicted on me. It was not, the prosecutor argued, the story of a man who survived an unthinkable tragedy and made one terrible choice in a moment of weakness. It was the story of a man who had been planning his own disappearance for the better part of a year and who had simply been handed, by horrific coincidence, the perfect cover story to execute a plan he had already set in motion. Before sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements, and I asked to give mine in person rather than have Patricia read it for me. I stood at a small podium, my hands trembling slightly on the folded paper I barely needed because I had rehearsed every line of it in my head for weeks. For 3 years, I said, I told my daughter a story about a hero. I told her that her father died doing his job, that he loved us, that the universe had simply been cruel to us in a way that had nothing to do with anything we'd done wrong. I believed that story myself, completely with my whole heart, because I had no reason not to. I have spent the months since I learned the truth trying to figure out how to tell a 5-year-old that the story was a lie, that her father is not a hero, that he is a man who looked at a wife and an infant daughter and decided we were a burden he could simply walk away from. There is no version of justice that gives me back those 3 years, or gives Sophie back a childhood that wasn't built on a false story about her own father. But I am asking this court to understand that what this man did was not an accident, was not a moment of weakness. It was a plan, executed over months, that used the deaths of 2 other men as a convenient disguise. He did not just abandon me. He built an entire architecture of lies on top of a tragedy, and he let that architecture stand for 2.5 years while I grieved, while his own mother helped him keep it standing, while I raised our daughter to believe in a man who had simply chosen to stop being her father. I am not asking for vengeance, Your Honor. I am asking for the consequence to match the calculation that went into the crime. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Marcus did not look up from the defense table. He was convicted on all counts. Insurance fraud, wire fraud, multiple counts of identity theft, and bigamy. The sentencing came down to 11 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving a significant portion of that time. The judge, in handing down the sentence, specifically addressed the fact that Marcus's deception had not been a singular lapse in judgment, but a sustained, years-long pattern of calculated deceit that had inflicted profound harm on 2 separate families and 2 children who would carry the consequences of his choices for the rest of their lives. I won't lie and tell you that watching him be led out of that courtroom in handcuffs gave me some clean, satisfying sense of closure. It didn't, not entirely. Grief doesn't work that neatly. I still had moments, even after the conviction, where I'd catch myself reaching for the old, false story, the hero who died in a crash, because that story, even though it was a lie, had at least been a kind story, a story I could tell Sophie without watching her small face crumble. Telling Sophie the truth was, without question, the hardest conversation of my life. I waited until the legal proceedings had concluded, until I had consulted with a child psychologist about how to frame something this enormous for a 4-year-old, soon to be 5. I told her, gently, in pieces, over the course of several conversations, that her daddy hadn't died in the crash like we'd thought, that he had survived but made a choice to go away and not come back, that it had nothing to do with anything she did, that she was loved completely and was not the reason any of this happened.
She cried. Of course she cried.
And then, with the particular resilience that children sometimes have, the kind that breaks your heart and rebuilds it in the same moment, she asked if this meant she had a little brother somewhere because Claire and I had, by then, decided to introduce the 2 children slowly, carefully, with the help of a family therapist guiding the process. You do, I told her. His name is Henry. Can I meet him? When you're ready. There's no rush. She thought about it for a long moment, her small face scrunched in concentration the exact same way Marcus is used to when he was working through a problem, a mannerism she'd inherited from a man who didn't deserve to have left her anything good, and yet somehow had, anyway, in the small, unconscious ways children carry their parents forward. I think I'm ready now, she said. That first meeting between Sophie and Henry happened in a park on a Saturday afternoon, both children cautious and curious, sizing each other up with the particular seriousness only small children can manage. Within 20 minutes, they were chasing each other around a jungle gym, laughing, completely unburdened by the enormous, complicated adult mess that had led to that moment, and watching them, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in nearly a year. Claire and I, against every reasonable expectation either of us might have had at the start of this, became something like friends. Not close, not immediately, but something steady and real, built slowly out of shared understanding rather than shared circumstance alone. We started coordinating holidays between the kids. We started checking in on each other, not about Marcus, but about ordinary things, work, parenting, the small accumulating griefs and joys of rebuilding a life from wreckage someone else created. It's been almost 2 years now since that night in the restaurant. Sophie is 6, sharp and funny and entirely her own person, carrying questions about her father that I answer as honestly as I can, in age-appropriate pieces, never hiding the truth, but never weaponizing it either. She and Henry see each other regularly. They argue like siblings do, over toys and attention, and it is, somehow, one of the most healing things to come out of this entire ordeal, watching 2 children build something real and uncomplicated out of the wreckage their father left behind. I went back to teaching kindergarten full-time. I sold the house Marcus and I had bought together, the weight of its memories finally outweighing whatever comfort familiarity used to offer, and bought a smaller place closer to my sister, closer to a life I was building entirely on my own terms. About a year after the conviction, I met someone. His name is Daniel, a contractor who came to give an estimate on renovating the kitchen of my new house and ended up staying for coffee after the appointment was technically over. I was guarded with him at first, more guarded than I had ever been with anyone in my life, watching for the smallest sign of the kind of carefully constructed charm that I now understood Marcus had always possessed in abundance. I should tell you something about my life before we go any further than coffee, I told him, the 3rd time we met, bracing myself for the inevitable retreat once he heard the whole story. He listened to the entire thing without interrupting, his face open and steady, and when I finished, he didn't say any of the things I'd braced for. He didn't ask if I'd somehow known, didn't get that uncomfortable, performative look of pity people sometimes get, didn't try to fill the silence with reassurances that felt hollow before they even left his mouth. That's not your story, he finally said. That's his. You're the part of the story where someone figured out the truth and didn't let it destroy her. That's a different story entirely. It took me a long time to believe that. It took me longer to let myself fall in love again, to let Sophie meet someone new without my stomach twisting with old fear. But slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild anything that's been broken down to its foundation, I did. Marcus writes to me sometimes from prison. I don't respond. I read the first 2 letters, mostly out of some compulsive need to understand a man I had spent 9 years married to and apparently never knew at all, but the letters offered nothing, just the same circular justifications, the same requests for understanding he had stood in my driveway and demanded that night, dressed up in slightly different language. I stopped opening them after that. Some doors, once you understand what's behind them, don't need to be opened again. There's a version of this story where I tell you I found some triumphant, dramatic vengeance, some courtroom moment where I delivered a perfect, cutting line, and the whole room gasped. That's not quite how it happened. The truth was slower, messier, and far more ordinary than that, built out of phone calls to lawyers and investigators, out of late nights going through old financial records, out of one hard, necessary conversation after another. But there was a kind of vengeance in it anyway, quiet and complete. Marcus tried to erase me and our daughter so thoroughly that he built an entirely new identity to replace the one he shared with us. And in the end, it was that exact identity, the meticulous architecture of his second life, that became the evidence that buried him. I think about that night at the restaurant sometimes, the breadstick basket, the shattered water glass, the half-second where our eyes met across a room and I watched a dead man come back to life and immediately try to disappear again. For a long time, I thought of that moment as the worst night of my life, worse even than the funeral, because at least the funeral had been honest in its grief. That restaurant was the night I learned the grief had been a lie too. But I've come to think of it differently now. That was the night the truth finally found its way back to me, however brutal the delivery. Everything that came after, the investigation, the trial, the conviction, the slow, strange friendship with a woman who had every reason to hate me and didn't, the sight of my daughter laughing with a brother she never knew she had, all of it grew out of that one unbearable second of recognition across a crowded restaurant. Sophie asked me recently, completely out of nowhere, the way kids ask the biggest questions in the most ordinary moments, whether I was happy now. I thought about it for a long moment before I answer her honestly. I'm getting there, I told her. Every day, a little more. She nodded, satisfied with that answer in the simple, trusting way children are satisfied by honesty even when it isn't a perfectly tied bow, and went back to building a tower out of her blocks on the living room floor, Henry's drawing from their last visit still taped to the refrigerator, Daniel's jacket hanging by the front door where it had started, almost without either of us noticing, to simply belong. And for the first time in 3 years, that wasn't a lie I was telling to protect her. It was simply, finally, the truth.